The beam from the military-grade flashlight sliced through the oppressive quiet of 1 a.m. in the Harmony Creek estates. It jittered for a moment, tracing the pristine edge of a perfectly manicured lawn before landing, with the accusatory glare of a police spotlight on the offender. It was ceramic, it was smiling, it wore a little red hat and held a tiny, ridiculous fishing pole. Carol Peterson drew in a sharp breath, the cool night air stinging her lungs. "Unbelievable," she whispered, her voice a low growl that was utterly at odds with the tranquil moonlit street. She clicked the flashlight off, plunging the gnome back into the shadows as if its very image was a corrupting influence. This was a violation of Article 4, Section 2B of the Harmony Creek Covenants. Conditions and restrictions, lawn and garden ornaments, which explicitly forbade any decorative items of a whimsical or folkloric nature. She knew the CC&Rs the way. A theologian knew scripture. For Carol, the thick binder on her nightstand wasn't a set of rules. It was a promise. A promise of order, of predictability, of skyrocketing property values. It was the sacred text that held chaos at bay, and she, as the duly elected president of the Homeowners Association, was its high priestess. The gnome belonged to the new owner of 312 Orchard Lane, a man named Leo Vance. He'd moved in 2 weeks ago, and Carol's internal threat assessment meter had been ticking ever since. The moving truck had been a garish orange, not the discreet white of most reputable companies. He'd been seen carrying canvases into the house, large, abstract, and distressingly colorful. He drove a vintage convertible that was a shade of blue not found in nature, and he played music, of all things, at a volume that was technically within the decibel limits but was, in Carol's opinion, spiritually disruptive. But this gnome, this was a declaration of war. The next morning, Carol sat at her gleaming granite countertop, a fortress of solitude in her immaculate bejond white kitchen. She typed with a surgeon's precision, her fingers striking the keys with sharp, definitive clicks. Official notice of VOLATO and date, August 4, 2025 to Mr. Leo Vance, 312 Orchard Lane from Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors. Subject: violation of Article 4, Section 2B, unapproved lawn ornamentation. This letter serves as official notification that your property is in violation of the Harmony Creek CC&RS. An unapproved decorative item, to wit, 1 ceramic garden gnome, has been observed on the front lawn. As per the governing documents, you have a cure period of 3 business days to rectify this violation. Failure to remove the offending item will result in a fine of $50. Escalating with further non-compliance. We trust you will give this matter the immediate attention it deserves to maintain the aesthetic integrity and harmony of our community. She printed the letter on the official HOA letterhead, slid it into a crisp envelope, and sealed it. There was no need for a stamp. She would deliver it herself. Walking across the street, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a guardian. When the Henderson family had let their lawn go brown 2 years ago, it was Carol who had arranged for a sprinkler repair service and billed them, saving the entire cul-de-sac from the creeping blight of neglect. When the Millers had tried to paint their front door burgundy instead of the approved oxblood, Carol had been there with the correct paint swatch and a recommendation for a reliable painter. She didn't do it to be a tyrant. She did it because no one else had the fortitude. She slipped the envelope into Leo Vance's mailbox, the metal flap clanging shut with a satisfying finality. The gnome, still smiling its idiotic smile, seemed to mock her. She gave it a narrow-eyed glare before turning on her heel and marching back to her own perfectly compliant home. 3 days passed. The gnome remained. On the 4th day, a $50 fine was duly posted to Leo Vance's account. On the 5th day, Carol was performing her morning patrol, a brisk walk around the neighborhood loop, when she stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The gnome was no longer alone. He was now flanked by 2 more gnomes. One was holding a protest sign, written in tiny defiant letters, "Gnome Liberation Front." The other was playing a miniature accordion. To add insult to injury, the original gnome was no longer holding a fishing pole. He was now holding a paintbrush, and beside him was a miniature easel displaying a perfect, tiny replica of her own house, but with a bright purple door. Rage, hot and pure, washed over Carol. This wasn't just non-compliance. This was mockery. This was a direct, personal attack on her authority. She was marching toward his front door, her fists clenched, when a soft voice stopped her. "He's certainly got a sense of humor, that one." Carol turned to see Mrs. Gable, a Harmony Creek original, who had lived here since the foundations were poured, watering her petunias. Her face was a gentle roadmap of wrinkles, and she looked at the gnome tableau with an amused twinkle in her eye. "It's not funny, Eleanor," Carol snapped, her voice tight. "It's a flagrant disregard for the rules that protect every single one of us." Mrs. Gable turned the nozzle on her hose to a fine mist. "Oh, I know the rules, dear. I was on the board back when we wrote half of them. But rules are like fences, Carol. They're meant to keep the bad things out, not to block the sunshine." She gestured with her chin toward Leo's house. "That boy's got a bit of vinegar in him, but sometimes a little vinegar is what a salad needs. Keeps it from being bland." Carol had no time for folksy metaphors. The salad was just fine. Eleanor, it was a perfectly balanced, meticulously arranged salad. She left Mrs. Gable to her petunias and her questionable wisdom, her resolve hardening into diamonds. This would not be handled on the lawns. This would be handled in the boardroom. The emergency HOA board meeting was held that Thursday. The other two board members, a perpetually tired accountant named Gerald and a mild-mannered retiree named Susan, sat looking uncomfortable under the fluorescent lights of the community clubhouse. Carol, at the head of the table, was a study in controlled fury. The issue, she began, her voice dangerously calm, is one of escalating noncompliance. Mr. Vance has not only ignored the initial violation notice and the subsequent fine, but he has tripled down on the infraction. It is a clear and calculated challenge to the authority of this board. Gerald fidgeted with a pen. It's just some gnomes. Carol, can't we just, I don't know, send him another fine? And what happens next, Gerald? Carol countered, leaning forward. When his defiance inspires Mrs. Miller to finally paint her door burgundy, when the Hendersons decide watering their lawn is optional, anarchy begins with a single crack in the dam. We are that dam. Before Susan could offer her usual non-committal platitude, the door to the clubhouse swung open. In walked Leo Vance. He was tall, with kind eyes and a disarmingly charming smile. He wore a paint-splattered t-shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the board's business casual attire. Evening, he said, his voice smooth and relaxed. I heard you were having a little meeting about my garden companions. I figured I should probably represent them. Carol's eyes narrowed. This is a closed board meeting, Mr. Vance. Oh, but the notice said you were discussing my property. So according to bylaw 7.3, I'm entitled to be present. I do read the material. He winked, and Carol felt a muscle in her jaw twitch. He took a seat, looking completely at ease. The gnomes are a symptom, Mr. Vance, Carol said, refusing to be rattled. Not the disease. Is the disease my desire to have a bit of fun with my own front yard? He asked pleasantly. Don't worry, I paid the fine. In fact, I have a proposal. Something that I believe will enhance the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood far more than another beige mailbox. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Carol. She opened it reluctantly. Inside were professional-looking architectural renderings. They depicted a sculpture, a large, abstract sculpture made of swooping, polished steel, intended for the center of his lawn. It was titled Ascension. It was modern. It was bold. It was everything Harmony Creek was not. It was the antithesis of her entire belief system. Absolutely not, she said, the words coming out like chips of ice. Why not? Leo asked. I'm formally submitting this for approval by the Architectural Review Committee, which is, well, it's you three, isn't it? Gerald looked horrified. Susan looked at her hands. It doesn't conform to community standards, Carol stated flatly. It's not traditional. It would be a distraction. It would lower property values. Or, Leo countered, his easygoing demeanor hardening slightly, it would be a landmark. It would signal that this is a forward-thinking community that values art, not just conformity. It might even raise property values for people who want to live somewhere with a soul. The word hung in the air. Soul. It was an accusation. We will vote, Carol announced, her patience gone. All in favor of denying the application for the Ascension sculpture. She raised her hand instantly. She looked at Gerald. He hesitated, visibly sweating, before slowly raising his 2 votes to deny. She turned to Susan. Susan wrung her hands. Well, it is rather unusual, Carol. But you have to admit, it's very striking. And Mr. Vance did follow the proper procedure in submitting it. She looked at. The drive back to Carol's house was the longest 60 yards of her life. The familiar, comforting geometry of her street now seemed mocking. Every perfectly spaced mailbox, every uniformly trimmed hedge, every neutral-toned facade was a testament to a world whose founding principles had just been exposed as a lie. Article 11, Community Enrichment. The words echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the symphony of order. She had so carefully composed that she unlocked her front door and stepped inside. The silence of her home was usually a comfort. Tonight was cavernous. The air, conditioned to a precise 72 degrees Fahrenheit, felt stale. Her gaze swept over the pristine living room, the beige sofa with its symmetrically placed throw pillows, the glass coffee table devoid of any clutter, the mantelpiece adorned with a single, elegant, and HOA-approved vase. For years, this sterile perfection had been her sanctuary. Now it felt like a museum to a dead idea. She sank onto the sofa, the leather sighing under her weight. Defeat was a bitter, unfamiliar taste. Susan's abstention was a wound, a betrayal from within her own ranks. But Leo's reveal of the forgotten clause was something far worse. It was a strategic masterstroke that hadn't just won him the battle, but had invalidated the very premise of the war. He hadn't broken the rules. He had found bigger, older rules. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over her. Maybe it was time to resign. Let Gerald and his nervous disposition handle the impending chaos. Let the neighborhood descend into a kaleidoscope of wind chimes, plastic flamingos, and avant-garde sculpture. Then, the image of Leo's face flashed in her mind. Not the charming smile, but the look of calm, intelligent victory. And behind it, she saw the smirking ceramic faces of the Gnome Liberation Front. The despair receded, replaced by a slow-burning diamond-hard resolve. He had outmaneuvered her on the grounds of aesthetics. Fine. The war was not over. It was merely moving to a new theater of operations. The clause said his art was subject to review for safety and structural integrity. A thin, dangerous smile touched Carol's lips. Aesthetics were subjective. Safety was absolute. The next 48 hours were a blur of furious activity. Carol's beige and white home became a war room. Her laptop, usually reserved for drafting HOA notices and balancing the budget, was now a gateway to a world of municipal codes, zoning laws, and engineering standards. She downloaded city ordinances on public nuisances. She researched soil mechanics and wind load capacities for non-standard structures. She spent 3 hours on the phone with the HOA's insurance provider, inquiring about liability riders for large-scale private art installations. By Sunday evening, she was ready. She drafted a new letter, a document so dense with language and technical demands that it was a work of art in its own right. Official request for supplementary DOCUHIO into Mr. Leo Vance, 312 Orchard Lane from Harmony Creek Estates HOA Architectural Review. Committee subject, pending application for Ascension Sculpture. Further to your submission and the invocation of Article 11. The committee requires the following documentation to conduct its mandated review of safety and structural integrity before your application can be processed. 1. A certified structural engineering report from a licensed PA, including foundational specifications and wind load calculations, rated for gusts up to 90 miles per hour. 2. Geotechnical soil analysis of the proposed installation site to determine soil stability and load-bearing capacity. 3. A detailed drainage plan to ensure the structure does not alter water runoff patterns affecting adjacent properties. 4. Proof of a minimum $2 million. Special liability insurance rider naming the Harmony Creek HOA as an additional insured party. 5. A signed affidavit from all adjacent neighbors, 310 and 314 Orchard Lane, acknowledging the installation. 6. A complete list of all materials used and their certified fire resistance rating. Please be advised that the 30-day review period will be paused until this documentation is received in full. She delivered it herself. Of course, she didn't slip it into his mailbox this time. She taped it squarely to his front door, right below the peephole. It was a statement, a siege. She expected a reaction. Another gnome, perhaps, a sarcastic email. Instead, there was silence. The gnomes remained, but their ranks did not grow. The sculpture renderings vanished from his window. For a week, Carol felt the sweet, intoxicating thrill of victory. She had buried him in a mountain of paper he could never hope to climb. Then, on the following Saturday, a new front opened in the war. It began not with steel, but with soil. A truck not garish orange this time, but a dusty farm truck arrived at Leo's house and deposited a massive pile of wood chips, another of compost, and a dozen burlap sacks of what looked like manure onto his driveway. By noon, Leo was out on his front lawn, stripped to the waist in the August sun, shovel in hand. He wasn't digging a foundation for a sculpture. He was building a garden, but it wasn't a Harmony Creek garden. There were no neat rows, no decorative mulch, no delicate blossoms. He was layering cardboard, compost, and wood chips into a sprawling, lumpy mound that looked, to Carol's horrified eyes, like a freshly dug grave. This was a new violation. Article 5, Section 4. All landscaping must be of a neat and orderly appearance, consisting primarily of turfgrass and approved shrubbery. Vegetable gardens are permitted only in rear yards and must be fully concealed from street view. Carol grabbed her binder and marched across the street. Vance, she barked. He paused, leaning on his shovel, sweat beading on his brow. He looked tired, but his eyes were defiant. Carol, he said, his voice even. To what do I owe the pleasure? You know perfectly well, she said, tapping the binder. This is not a neat and orderly landscape, and vegetable gardens are explicitly forbidden. In front yards, is this a vegetable garden? He asked, gesturing to the mound. I don't see any vegetables. I see a dynamic, soil-building ecosystem. It's a permaculture, hagelkultur bed. Carol stared at him blankly. It's a pile of dirt and garbage in your front yard. It's a long-term project, he said, turning back to his work. You can't judge a masterpiece by the first brushstroke. The battle of the hagelkultur raged for 2 weeks. Carol issued a violation notice. Leo responded with a 3-page letter, complete with diagrams, explaining that it was a xeriscaping installation designed for water conservation, which was, in fact, encouraged by a different city ordinance. The neighborhood began to cleave in two. The Millers, emboldened, planted a row of garish red salvia along their walkway. In response, the Hendersons, staunch Carol loyalists, reported the Millers for having a garden hose that was not coiled in a perfectly circular fashion. The conflict was metastasizing. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable appeared at Carol's door, holding A small basket of cherry tomatoes? From my backyard, she announced, stepping past Carol into the kitchen. Thought you might like some. It's always better when you grow it yourself. Carol looked at the ruby-red fruit. It felt like a tiny, edible Trojan horse. Thank you, Eleanor, she said stiffly. This business with the garden, Mrs. Gable said, ignoring Carol's tone, reminds me of my late husband, Arthur. He tried to grow corn in the front yard once. Back in '82, the board, I was on it then, told him he couldn't. So you know what he did. Carol sighed. What did he do, Eleanor? He planted sunflowers, dozens of them. Grew 15 feet tall. Weren't technically vegetables, you see. The board was fit to be tied, but there wasn't a rule against excessively tall flowers. Sometimes, Carol, you can't win by adding more rules. You just have to let the sunflowers grow. Carol did not want to let the sunflowers grow. She wanted to salt the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the solution came to her. It was so simple, so elegant. She wasn't just fighting an HOA battle, she was a citizen. And Leo's messy, organic pile of a garden wasn't just ugly. It was dangerous. The next morning, she made a call. Not to the HOA lawyer, but to the city code enforcement office. Yes, I'd like to report a potential fire hazard, she said, her voice dripping with civic concern. My neighbor at 312 Orchard Lane has piled a large amount of combustible material, wood chips, dry leaves, straw directly against his house. With how dry it's been, I'm genuinely concerned for the safety of the entire neighborhood. 2 hours later, a white city pickup truck pulled up. A weary-looking man in a collared shirt with a City of Harmony Creek patch on the sleeve got out. His name was Frank. Carol watched from her window as he walked the perimeter of Leo's property. Clipboard in hand, he knocked on the door. Leo came out, and the two men spoke for several minutes. Leo pointed and gesticulated. Frank nodded slowly. Making notes. Carol felt a grim, righteous satisfaction. She was no longer just the HOA president. She was a protector of public safety. She had escalated the conflict to a higher, unimpeachable authority. Frank finished his inspection of Leo's yard and started walking back to his truck. Carol, unable to resist, came out onto her porch. Everything in order. Officer, she called out, a note of triumph in her voice. Frank stopped and looked at her. There's a minor violation, he said, his voice flat. The mulch pile is a few feet too close to the exterior wall. I'm issuing him a notice to cure. He'll have to move it back. Minor victory. The white city pickup truck pulled away from the curb, its departure leaving a void in the unnervingly quiet street. The official notice, a flimsy piece of paper detailing her transgression, felt as heavy as a tombstone in Carol's hand. Her prize-winning yard of the month, deep crimson Japanese barberry shrubs, were not just plants. They were statements of intent. They were proof that with enough care, enough diligence, one could impose perfect, beautiful order onto a chaotic world. And they were illegal. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a hot flush that started in her chest and spread to the tips of her ears. She could feel the curtain-witching gaze of her neighbors, the silent judgment of the very people she had sworn to protect. She risked a glance across the street. Leo was still standing there, by his monstrous pile of hagam. He hadn't moved. His expression, which she had initially misread as pity, now resolved into something more complex. A weary recognition, as if he were looking at a fellow soldier wounded on a battlefield of their own making. Without a word, Carol turned, walked into her house with the rigid posture of a queen going to the gallows, and shut the door. The click of the lock echoed in the silent, perfect house. She leaned against the door, her fortress walls breached, her authority in ashes. She had flown too close to the sun on wings of bureaucratic wax, and now she was in a free fall. Her first instinct was to fight. She spent the next 2 days on the phone, navigating the labyrinthine automated menus of the city's planning and parks departments. She argued, she cited precedents. She demanded to speak to supervisors. The response was always the same, a polite, but immovable wall of bureaucratic certainty. The ordinance was clear. The species was invasive. No exceptions. Her own tactics, her own beloved weapons of rules and regulations, were being used against her with flawless efficiency. Defeated, she called 3 landscaping companies, the very ones she kept on the HOA's preferred vendor list. The quotes were astronomical. Hazardous plant removal, they called it, citing the spiky thorns and the deep, tenacious root systems. It would cost nearly $1,000. $1,000 to undo her own perfection. The sum was an insult, but the idea of paying one of her approved landscapers to dismantle her shame in front of the entire neighborhood was unbearable. There was only one way. It was a penance, a self-flagellation. She would do it herself. That Saturday, as the sun began its ascent, Carol emerged from her garage. She wore old jeans and a faded t-shirt, an alien costume for a woman who was rarely seen in anything less than crisp linen trousers. In her hands, she held a pair of thick leather gloves and a long-handled spade. She started with the shrub nearest the walkway. The thorns, sharp as needles, tore at her gloves and sleeves. She dug the spade into the soil around its base, but the ground, compacted and dry, was like concrete. The roots were a tangled, stubborn web, clinging to the earth with a ferocity she had to begrudgingly respect. An hour in, she was drenched in sweat, her back screaming in protest. She had managed to loosen only one side of the root ball. Her pristine lawn was now scarred with clumps of upturned dirt. This was her new reality, no longer a queen surveying her immaculate kingdom, but a mud-streaked laborer trying to tear it down. Looks like a tough job. Carol froze, spade in hand. Mrs. Gable stood on the sidewalk, holding a tall, sweating glass of lemonade. "Thought you might need this," she said, her voice gentle. Carol straightened up, wiping a muddy forearm across her brow. "It has to be done," she said, her voice strained. "Arthur had a time with those sunflowers, too," Mrs. Gable continued, setting the glass down on the porch step. "When it came time to pull them, the stalks were thick as your wrist, and the roots went halfway to China." He cursed and swore for a whole weekend. She smiled at the memory. "But you know, the next spring, that patch of soil was the best in the yard. All that struggle tilled it up nicely." She looked at Carol's exhausted face. "Sometimes a garden needs a good, hard prune to grow back stronger, dear. The same goes for the gardener." Mrs. Gable patted Carol's arm and ambled away, leaving the lemonade and the cryptic wisdom hanging in the air. Carol drank the lemonade in 3 long gulps. It was sweet and tart, a moment of relief in a day of punishment. But Mrs. Gable's words offered little comfort. This didn't feel like pruning, it felt like amputation. By late afternoon, she had managed to excavate and remove exactly 1 bush. It lay on the driveway like a vanquished beast, its thorny branches accusatory even in death. 15 more to go. The scale of the task, of her failure, was crushing. That evening, she was forced to face her next humiliation. She convened an emergency board meeting via Zoom. She appeared on screen from her perfect living room, but she knew Gerald and Susan could see the exhaustion etched on her face. "As you both may be aware," she began, the formal words tasting like ash, "I have received a notice of violation from the city of Harmony Creek regarding a non-compliant landscaping installation on my own property." Gerald's eyes widened in panic, as if non-compliance were a contagious disease that might travel through the internet. Susan, however, leaned closer to her camera, her expression one of genuine concern. "The offending flora will be removed, and I will be in full compliance within the mandated 30-day period." Carol continued, her voice a monotone. "I simply wanted the board to be officially apprised of the situation." "Oh, Carol, I'm so sorry to hear that," Susan said, her voice soft. "That must be awful. Those shrubs were so lovely. Is there anything the HOA can do to help?" The offer of help, especially from the woman whose abstention had started this whole spiral, was like a physical blow. "No, thank you, Susan," Carol said, stiffly. "I have it under control." The meeting ended quickly. Carol logged off and sat in the deepening twilight, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. She was utterly, completely alone. She put on her muddy shoes and went back outside. The air was cooler now. She looked at the remaining 15 shrubs, a dark, thorny wall between her and absolution. She picked up the spade. She had to keep going. She had been digging for another 20 minutes when a porch light flicked on across the street. She didn't look up, focusing on the stubborn route she was trying to sever. She heard a screen door creak open and shut. She heard footsteps on asphalt. She kept digging, her jaw tight. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Leo Vance standing on her lawn. He was holding a formidable-looking Chavola heavy-duty tool with a sharpened steel head and a pair of worn work gloves. He didn't speak. He didn't offer platitudes or mock her. He simply walked to the next shrub in the line, found a spot, and plunged his shovel into the earth with a grunt of effort. The sound of his steel spade striking the hard soil echoed the thud of her own, worked in silence. 2 feet apart, a strange and unspoken truce forming in the shared rhythm of their labor. He was a more efficient digger, using his weight and leverage to pry at the root balls in a way she hadn't managed. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to her own task, her pace quickening to match his. They were a team, a bizarre, adversarial team, dismantling the very symbol of their conflict. After 10 minutes of shared, grunting silence, he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy with effort. He didn't look at her. "The engineering reports for the sculpture," he said, pausing to wipe his brow with the back of a gloved hand, "are going to cost me almost $5,000. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a complaint. It was a simple, unadorned fact, a piece of information, offered up into the space between them. He was showing her the cost of her war, the very real consequences of the bureaucratic siege she had laid upon him." Carol stopped digging. She leaned on her spade, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the hole in her lawn, at the man standing in the ruins of her pride, and a piece of the rigid certainty inside her finally broke. She looked at him, really seeing him for the first time, not as a symbol of chaos, but as a person, tired and stubborn, just like her. "The soil analysis is the real killer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They have to drill core samples." It was an admission, a confession that she knew exactly what she had done, that she understood the weight of the burdens she had demanded he carry. He stopped digging and looked at her, his silhouette framed by the streetlight. The animosity between them was gone. replaced by a shared, weary understanding. They were two enemies who had fought each other to a standstill, only to find themselves bleeding from the same wounds. The war wasn't over, but standing there in the dirt and darkness, surrounded by the thorny casualties of their conflict, the terms of engagement had irrevocably, seismically, changed. The silence that followed Carol's admission hung in the cool August night, thicker than the humidity. For the first time, a piece of her meticulously constructed armor had fallen away, and she had shown her adversary the map of his own siege. Admitting she knew every planned assault, Leo drove his shovel into the ground and leaned on it, his posture mirroring hers. He was no longer just the chaotic force from 312 Orchard Lane. He was a man who had been quoted $5,000 to express himself. She was no longer the infallible guardian of the covenants. She was a woman facing a $1,000 landscaping bill and a yard full of thorny violations. They were equals, finally, in the cost of their convictions. "Tell you what," Leo said, his voice quiet. "I've got a strong back and I hate these thorny bastards almost as much as you do. I help you finish this." He gestured with his chin at the remaining line of shrubs. ... "And you help me figure out how to climb that mountain of paperwork without having to sell my car." It was a peace treaty, a pragmatic, transactional offer that bypassed pride and emotion entirely. It appealed to the part of Carol that was, above all else, a problem solver. Fighting Leo had become illogical, a resource-draining quagmire with no clear victory condition. Cooperating had a defined objective. She straightened up, her own spine stiffening out of habit. A temporary cessation of hostilities for the purpose of mutual project completion, she stated, as if dictating the minutes of a meeting. That would be ... a logical course of action. A slow smile spread across Leo's face. Right, a cessation of hostilities. The next day, a Sunday, became a spectacle for the residents of Harmony Creek. The news, transmitted via the neighborhood's hyper-efficient gossip telegraph, was that Carol Peterson and the Gnome King were working together. Cars slowed down as they passed. The Hendersons peered through their blinds, utterly bewildered. The Millers stood on their porch, watching with open mouths as Carol, the HOA president, held a stubborn root, taut while Leo Vance, public enemy number one, attacked it with a pickaxe he'd brought from his garage. Their collaboration was a clumsy dance of opposing philosophies. Carol would try to systematize the work, mapping out a grid and calculating the most efficient order of removal. Leo would ignore her, pick the angriest-looking bush, and attack it with creative brute force. To her immense frustration, his method was often faster. They argued about the best way to coil the hose, the proper depth for a fulcrum, and the optimal trajectory for flinging a dislodged root ball onto the growing pile of horticultural corpses on her driveway. It was maddening, it was exhausting, and by Sunday evening, as the sun set, all 16 Japanese barberry shrubs were gone. Her lawn was a disaster, a patchwork of gaping wounds and churned soil. It was the most imperfect her property had been in a decade. Strangely, looking at the raw, exposed earth, she didn't feel shame. She felt a blank slate. True to their treaty, the following Tuesday evening, the war moved from the yard to her dining room table. Leo came over with his folder, the one containing her intimidating list of demands. He spread the documents out. On the polished wood surface, a hostile army invading her sacred space. But now, Carol's perspective had shifted. She was no longer looking for ways to use the rules to stop him. She was looking for ways to use them to solve the problem. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of bureaucratic navigation, began to work its magic. "This engineering report," she said, tapping a quote from a high-end firm, "they're charging you for a full-spectrum analysis designed for commercial structures. It's overkill. The city ordinance only requires a residential certification. I know an independent engineer who owes me a favor. He can do it for a third of the price." She moved to the next item. The soil analysis. You don't need to drill core samples yourself. You can piggyback on the city's geological survey data. For this subdivision, it's public record. You just need to file a records request. Form 11B. For 2 hours, she dissected her own labyrinth and demands. She found city grants for public art installations that could offset the cost. She drafted a new, simplified application that met every technical requirement while presenting the project in the most favorable light. She was brilliant. The skills she had honed as a weapon were just as effective as a tool of creation. Leo watched her, a look of grudging awe on his face. "You're really good at this," he said. "I am aware of my competencies," Carol replied, not looking up from a zoning map. The following week, they presented the new, ironclad proposal to the board. Gerald looked at the pristine, perfectly formatted application, his face a mask of confusion. He had expected Carol to report the failure of the project. Instead, she was advocating for its success. Susan, on the other hand, was beaming. "I knew you two could find a way to work together," she chirped. "We have simply aligned on a path of mutual compliance," Carol corrected her. The board, with Susan's enthusiastic eye and Gerald's bewildered, reluctant eye, approved the application pending a final community feedback session. The feedback session was scheduled for the Monday of Labor Day weekend, marking the unofficial end of summer. The atmosphere in the community clubhouse was thick with tension. The story of Carol and Leo's truce had divided the neighborhood. A camp of modernists and rule-weary residents saw it as a sign of progress. A larger, more vocal camp of traditionalists, led by the Hendersons, saw it as a betrayal. Carol and Leo stood at the front of the room together. He spoke about his artistic vision, the meaning of ascension. Then Carol, in her element, walked the residents through the revised proposal, detailing the safety measures, the minimal financial impact, and the adherence to every conceivable bylaw and ordinance, including the long-forgotten Article 11. "She's been brainwashed," Mr. Henderson declared from the back. "He's corrupted her with his gnomes and his jazz music." A heated debate erupted. It was no longer about a sculpture. It was about the soul of Harmony Creek. It was the old guard versus the new, conformity versus expression, fear versus possibility. Finally, Carol called for a vote, a simple straw poll to advise the board. As hands went up, she could see it was close, terrifyingly close. But as Susan began to count, a different voice cut through the room. "Point of order, Madam President." All heads turned. It was Gerald, her quiet, nervous yes-man accountant. He was standing now, his face pale but his hands surprisingly steady. "What is it, Gerald?" Carol asked, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "According to the bylaws," Gerald said, his voice gaining a quavering strength as the traditionalists turned to him with encouraging looks, "any member can call for a procedural vote at any time during a community meeting." "And," Carol said, her voice sharp. Gerald took a deep breath. "I move for a vote of no confidence in our president, Carol Peterson." A collective gasp went through the room. Leo stiffened beside her. "On what grounds?" Carol demanded, her voice dangerously low. "On the grounds," Gerald announced, his voice now ringing with the conviction of the recently converted, "that she has demonstrably abandoned her primary duty to uphold the established aesthetic standards of this community. She has entered into a partnership with an agent of non-compliance and is actively working to subvert the very principles she was elected to protect." It was a coup, a mutiny led by her most timid lieutenant. The debate was no longer about Leo's sculpture. It was about her. The power she had wielded for so long, the authority she had sacrificed everything to maintain, was being turned against her. Carol looked from Gerald's triumphant face to the divided, uncertain expressions of her neighbors. She stood beside the man who had been her greatest enemy, who was now her only ally, and realized with chilling clarity that the war for Harmony Creek was not over. The hardest, most personal battle had just begun. A shocked silence descended upon the clubhouse, thick and suffocating. Gerald, flushed with a sense of purpose Carol had never seen in him, remained standing, a petty Napoleon tasting his first moment of power. Across the room, Mr. Henderson and his faction of traditionalists looked on with grim approval. They had found their champion. Carol felt Leo shift beside her, a protective, angry energy radiating from him. Her first instinct, the instinct of the old Carol, was to gavel the meeting into oblivion, to dissect Gerald's motion on a dozen procedural technicalities until he was left sputtering in a pile of his own shredded Robert's Rules of Order. But the woman who had spent a weekend on her hands and knees in the dirt, who had found common ground with her sworn enemy over a shared sense of weary defeat, was not the same. She looked at Gerald, not with rage, but with a clarity that was almost serene. He was not a villain. He was terrified. He was clinging to the old rules because it was the only thing he knew, just as she once had. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. "A motion for a vote of no confidence has been made and seconded. According to our governing documents, such a motion is in order." A wave of surprise rippled through the room. Leo shot her a look of disbelief. She was not fighting back. She was allowing it. "Before we vote," Carol continued, her gaze sweeping the room, landing on every face, "the floor is open for discussion." Mr. Henderson was the first to his feet. "It's simple," he boomed, his face red. "We elected Carol to protect our investments, to maintain the standards that make this neighborhood a desirable place to live, and she has failed. She is siding with the man who wants to turn this community into some kind of bizarre art park." What's next? Wind chimes, cars on blocks. "This is about protecting our way of life." A smattering of applause followed. The fear in the room was palpable. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of losing control. As Henderson sat down, another figure rose. To Carol's surprise, it was Leo. He looked uncomfortable in the spotlight, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I'm not going to talk about my art," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "I want to talk about your president. For weeks, she and I were at war. She buried me in fines and paperwork. She did her job exactly the way you wanted her to, but then something changed. She got a violation notice of her own." He glanced at Carol, and she didn't fight it with lawyers. She went out there with a shovel, and she tore up her own perfect yard, because it was the right thing to do. Then she sat down with me and used her knowledge of the rules, not to punish me, but to help me. I don't know what you call that, but I call it integrity." He sat down, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Then, from the back of the room, a third person stood up. It was Mrs. Gable. She held her old straw handbag in front of her, her back as straight as a garden stake. "I was here when they wrote the first rules for this place," she said, her voice thin but clear as a bell. "I remember my Arthur fighting the board over his corn, and I remember the joy on the children's faces when he grew those giant sunflowers. Instead, we wrote rules back then to make sure the place didn't fall apart, not to put it in a glass box. That artistic expression rule wasn't a mistake, it was a promise. A promise that this would be a place for living, not just for looking at." She fixed her gaze on the crowd. "For 5 years, Carol Peterson has been a fierce, unyielding guardian of our fences, and we should thank her for that. But this summer, she learned how to open a gate. And that, my friends, is a much harder and much braver thing to do. That is the kind of leader I want." The room was hushed. All eyes turned to Carol. This was her moment. She walked to the center of the podium, not as a defendant, but as the president she still was. "Mrs. Gable is right," she began. "For a long time, I believed my only job was to protect this community from every crack in the pavement, every unapproved paint color, every blade of grass that dared to be different. I governed with a binder and a flashlight. I was wrong." She took a breath, the admission feeling like a release. "A community isn't a collection of compliant houses, it's a collection of people. The foundation isn't the concrete in our sidewalks, it's the connections and the compromises between our homes. I spent so much time trying to enforce a perfect, sterile harmony that I forgot to leave any room for life, for sunflowers, for art." She looked directly at Gerald, then at the Henderson. "I cannot be the president you want me to be anymore. I will not govern from a place of fear. If you vote me out tonight, I will understand. But if I remain your president, we will move forward. We will find a way to be a community that values both its standards and its soul." She paused. "We will now vote on the motion of no confidence. All in favor of removing me as president, please raise your hand." Slowly, hands went up. The Henderson faction, Gerald, a handful of others. Susan, her eyes wet with tears, kept her hands firmly in her lap. "All opposed," Carol said, her voice steady. Leo's hand shot up. Susan's, the Millers. A surprising number of faces in the middle, who had been silent until now, raised their hands. And finally, Mrs. Gable, with a defiant smile, raised hers high. They counted. The final tally was 18 in favor of removal. 25 opposed. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak washed over Carol. She had survived. She looked at Leo, who gave her a single, triumphant nod. "The motion fails," Carol announced, her voice regaining its familiar strength. "The next item of business is the advisory poll on the Ascension sculpture. All in favor, ... double quotes." The vote wasn't even close. The tide had turned. The sculpture was approved. The meeting was adjourned. 1 week later, the Harmony Creek estates felt different, and the gnomes had vanished from Leo's lawn. A quiet gesture of peace. In their place, a small team was carefully laying the concrete foundation for Ascension. The raw, exposed earth was a promise. Carol stood on her own porch, looking at the scarred expanse of her front yard. It was still a mess of dirt, a testament to her uprooting. In her hand, she held a landscaping catalog, but she wasn't looking at hedges or barberry bushes. She was looking at pictures of native, chaotic, beautiful plants, purple coneflowers, wild bergamot, goldenrod. The screen door creaked open behind her, not hers, but his. Leo crossed the street, holding 2 sweating bottles of beer. He handed one to her without a word. "To the cessation of hostilities," he said, touching his bottle to hers. "To the new terms of engagement," she replied, taking a sip. It tasted like victory. They sat on her porch steps, the 2 unlikely allies, looking out at their 2 properties. One, the site of a new creation. The other, a blank slate, waiting for a new kind of life to be planted. The traditionalists still grumbled during their morning walks. And Gerald had already submitted his resignation from the board. The peace was fragile, the future unwritten. "So," Leo said, gesturing with his beer toward her yard, "what's the master plan? More beige." Carol looked at the bare earth, then at the foundation taking shape across the street. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in a long time. "I'm not sure," she said, and for the first time in her life, that uncertainty felt like freedom. "I think I'm going to let it be a little wild."